Okay, I'm showing that I'm live and in color here, so we're about ready to go. How we'll do this is a typical thing is as I go along, if you've got a question while I'm there, let's try to get them out when we're there so we don't forget about them and try to tack them on the end as opposed to the way we did it in Grantham in November. So we'll take questions as we go. I'll repeat them back because we're recording. So we're not going to pass mics or do anything like that for the question. So when you ask a question, I'll repeat it back and then I'll ask Dick to answer because I probably won't know the answer. So we'll go like that. But or I'll make something up. That's a good way to do that too. So you've got a basic idea what we're going to talk about here. If you happen to grab one, I notice there's still one or two of the brochures out there on the table that we used for the November thing, and that's only valuable to you if you care about the sources that are involved in this presentation. So if you care about that, pick up one of those brochures out there, if there are any left out there at the time, and it's got a list of all the sources, and there's quite a number of them. In here. I did not reference each slide, each thing, everything, because it's not an academic thing, just me talking. Terms and timelines. A lot of the talking we're going to be doing today in this presentation has to do with terms and timelines. Who are these people? What's the name of them? What is Israel? What is Hamas? What is the Middle East? What are all these things? We need to have some kind of common idea about those as we go along in order to get to the part where we're talking about what's going on now. And so probably at least half of this presentation will be history. How we got to here now in the thing, how we got to these players in this situation right now. And then, of course, that whole thing involves timelines. And so what we're going to do is start way back in the Wayback Machine. Any of those who remember Tom Terrific and his wonder dog, the Manfred, we're going to go all the way back to the BC time period here. And this is a pretty illuminating timeline if you look at it and see kind of what we're talking about here. And the areas or the things on that line in yellow, in the bright neon yellow, if you read the script there, that's when the Jewish people were living in Israel, but were not self-ruling. So they lived there, but they were under the control or under the thumb of some other group of people. The blue lines, the blue sections, are when they were living in Israel and were in control of the area or the country themselves. And so you see that there are some blue and yellow lines up until about 70 AD. That's a long time ago. After 70 AD, for a couple thousand years, there are no yellow or blue lines, meaning there was no Jewish presence to speak of, and especially no Jewish government in the area for that 2,000-year period. And at the far right of the chart, there you will see the small yellow and the small blue areas, and that's the current time when there is actually a country called Israel and a place called that. So that gives us an idea about timelines, how and when Israel came to be as a country, and when there were actually Jews living in Israel or in Palestine as we go along. And so in order to get there, now we have to say, what's Palestine, right? So, well, nobody knows, right? That's the answer. Nobody knows. There has never been a place called Palestine. Never. There's Palestinians and there are Israelis, peoples, but not country, not places, nothing with borders and things. This, if you look back on the previous chart, for over 1,000 years, close to 2,000 years, This whole area where Israel is now and the things was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Okay. They had a word in Turkish that kind of sounds a little bit like Palestine or things, and that's where the name came from. And it had to do with the ethnicity of the people living there in the region at the time. There was never any area designated or called Palestine. That all changed. Remember that chart we just skipped over now out of the Ottoman Empire? We are now up to the World War I. And Turkey picked the wrong side to join up with in World War I. They ended up joining the Axis powers and they were defeated in World War I, one of the defeated countries. So what? They lost everything in that. So hence we get to this chart after World War I. At the end of World War I, it's kind of divided up. And you see that little yellow area there. That's kind of the area we know now as Israel, kind of. It's going to change some, and we're going to talk about that. But this is the first time there's any kind of a space on the ground that is kind of be designated for a Jewish homeland. Okay, and that's as promised by the Balfour Declaration. So these are some of these things where you just have to read them. And here's the Balfour Declaration, and that's the part down below the kind of bigger group of texts there. That is the Balfour Declaration, and this is the whole reason that there is a place called Israel. This happened in 1917. This declaration. Now, it's important to know how did this declaration come about? There was an extremely rich, extremely powerful lobbyist in London who convinced the British government to do this and write this thing. And that's how this came to be. It was a lobbyist input. And this lobbyist was powerful enough that he went on to become the first president of Israel after it was formed from the UK, moved from the UK to do that. So this is an important thing to recognize, is that it was Britain who was allocated all of this area in the treaties subsequent to the First World War, and they made a pledge, Britain made a pledge to create a homeland for the Jews. And so they did. Now, it took what? We went from 1917, 1922, now we're up to 1948. And why is 1948? Because the British mandate, that thing we saw in the last slide, terminated on this date. May 14th, 1948, they no longer had the mandate. Britain no longer had the power. They no longer were in control. So they had to do something. So what'd they do? Proclaimed a new state of Israel at the time. So May 14th, 1948, you see on the little picture on the right, the U.S. acquiesced to that designation, and then later on we actually supported it in the time. So that was the beginning of the state of Israel. Now, these are how this all happened. It ended up being kind of divided up like this. This is, once again, according to the British. They made this designation. So the area you see in the light color gray there is the part that goes to Israel. And the part you see in the kind of inset map where there's two parts, a Gaza Strip and a West Bank, those were allocated to the Palestinians by the British. So that's how this was divided up. Those two areas were not part of Israel at the time. Those were designated as Palestinian homelands and areas. Now, you see the British mandate ended on May 15th. And guess what? That's the first Arab-Israeli war. Same day. So the day that happened, especially from Israel and Syria, Egypt and Syria, they invaded this new country, this new space, Israel, and the war was on. Israel, as a new country, ended up prevailing because of support from the United States and Britain, who gave them tons of weapons and equipment. So they ended up being better supplied, better equipped, better trained than their opponents, and they ended up winning. And so these boundaries were established in the armistice. You see their bottom, 1949, and that's how we got to where we're at. Now you hear this term, the West Bank, all the time. Here's the West Bank. What is the West Bank? Well, it's the West Bank of what? The Jordan River, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and it was controlled by who? Jordan. Yeah, it was originally part of Jordan transnational state. When this thing called Israel was developed, there was going to be a Palestinian authority in there, but it was controlled by Jordan at the time. Some of these things, this is kind of a mishmash on this slide to give you an idea what the West Bank is and what it looks like. If you look at that map on there, and then you can kind of see what at the inset, what the color coding means. Essentially, all the beige or whatever color you call that is on there. Those are the Palestinian designated areas. Okay? And we're going to talk about how this thing got to be this modeled, kind of messed up looking thing like this. This is the current version. It wasn't like that. Initially, the whole thing was beige because it was all Palestinian. This is what it looks like now. And all those they're really kind of hard to see, but you kind of see the dark green little spots that are everywhere. Those are Jewish settlements. So this is part of the ongoing saga of why there's a war going on over there, because these settlements keep going and going and going. And they're put in these places that were supposed to be Palestinian control past things. So this is important to know why this map looks like it does and what the implications are of these colors. And this is the West Bank. When you hear that in the news, hear about that, that's the West Bank. A lot of people have heard of the Jewish diaspora. Diaspora means you disappear from your homeland. The Jews disappeared from their homeland when? Remember from our first slide? 70 AD, or maybe 135, depending on which source you hear. What happened is 70 AD, the Romans knocked down the temple. So by common usage, 70 AD is when the diaspora started, and the Jews were ejected from their homeland. It really actually didn't start then. It really started in earnest in 135 AD because there's a big uprising. Anybody heard of the term zealots? Remember that? Well, it's a biblical term, means more now because of that group, but there's a group called zealots, and they had a civil war going on inside Israel against the Romans. Finally, the Romans got mad and said, and they killed everybody in the thing. They said, enough's enough. And they said, you went too far, you're out. And that's not the Roman way. The Roman way was to always leave the countries as they were, leave their own rulers, leave their own things. Just don't talk bad to us and don't make us mad. That's the Roman way. Well, they'd had enough in 135 and they threw all the Jewish people out, and that's the diaspora. That's why there's no more yellow and blue lines. Well, this is the Palestinian diaspora. When did it start? 1948, when Israel became a country and started throwing the Palestinians out. So this line, as you see here, is how many people have either been forcibly ejected or driven out of what they consider their homeland in all those areas. So it's close to 2 million people. Depending on which sources, this goes to 6 million, but that's pretty high. But what they mean by driven out, you can get to 6 million because they consider all the people that have been forced inside the Gaza Strip and inside the West Bank to be part of the diaspora because they've been ejected from their homeland. They're now confined to these two areas. So that's why this slide's important. Jerusalem. This has been a sticking point since there's been what? Jerusalem. It's been that way forever as the history of things. It's the home to 3 major religions and several others floating around. So the 3 that we know about are the Muslim religion, the Christian religion, and the Jewish religion. Those are the big 3. Jerusalem's one of the most holy places to all 3 of those religions. So there's always conflict going on there. Color coding in the map here. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a color coding on which sector. There's 4 sectors inside Jerusalem. It's kind of unofficially divided up between those 4 sectors. Okay? And then in the little white blocks, it gives you an indication of where these most holy sites are in which sector and which thing, and they're not necessarily in the sector of the religion they're most holy to. So what does that cause? All the time for what? A couple thousand years on the thing. So Jerusalem is a real flashpoint in this area forever. Here's a little, slide that kind of gives you an idea of what happened in the area and who controlled Jerusalem when. So the Old Temple period, before the Old Temple, was controlled by the Jewish population of things, before the Romans came. Okay, so before the Romans came, it was controlled by the Jewish people. Then they got thrown out. After the Second Temple, 70 AD, they got thrown out. The Muslim religion really took off in the early middle 600s. And in 691, then we've got the Dome of the Rock, which is probably the second most important site in Islam. And it became a religious site. And then for how many years did the Muslims own Jerusalem? Almost 2,000 years, from 671 until 1917, it's controlled by the Muslims. So 671 to 1917, controlled by the Muslims. So Jerusalem's been a Muslim city longer than anything that we can look at until you go back to 4000 BC. And then Christians for about this long, right? Doesn't even show up on the chime chart if you want to put it in there because the line's too narrow, because it only happened during the Crusades. And that's the only time that Jerusalem has been controlled and where Christians have been in charge of everything. And so what did that cause? The Crusades. Been fighting the Crusades ever since. Ever since, because they don't forget that kind of thing. So that's what happens, and that's why Jerusalem is such a flashpoint. Jerusalem is a city of hats and uniforms. How many people have been to Jerusalem? 1, 2. It's quite the place. Quite the place. And I was, and you still are amazed when you walk around and you see this. Everywhere you look is different uniform, different hat. Everywhere. All these different religions, all these different sects, nuns and priests and imams and Jewish sects of every variety. They're everywhere. And they're really not killing each other every day in there, inside the city. So it kind of goes on. It's a kind of a controlled chaos. They kind of cohabitate. There's this thing. How many people have heard the word status quo? Yeah, well, guess where it came from? Jerusalem. It's a formal thing. It is a formal thing. You can kind of read the framework here, the background. This is how this thing, it's called the status quo. And it's defined in excruciating detail which religion controls which site and what they can do and how flamboyant they can be and when they can ring their bells and when they can light their incense, and everything is in the status quo. And it's still in force, and it's still monitored every day inside Jerusalem. So it's one of the things that helps kind of control this chaos, but also helps create it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because if you... Question?
Who enforces it?
The question was, who enforces the thing? And the answer is no one. There's no central agency, except what happens when somebody goes out, colors outside the lines. This is what happens, and somebody enforces it. And then they say, whoa, we don't really want this to happen. So everybody kind of takes a deep breath and backs up. There's no overarching agency. There was when it started, because the Muslims were in control. 1700s, when this thing was written, in the 1700s. They were in control, and they smacked down, and they were really very good at that. They did not pick sides. And that's important to remember. They didn't pick sides. They slapped down. If you were not following the rules, they were on you, whichever side. Still causes problems, still helps solve problems. So
the rules as they were established, generally very fair. I mean, so everyone had input into this, and everybody kind of grudgingly agreed that, okay, you could do this.
Okay, the question is, did everybody have an input, and was it fair? And the answer is no, because it was written by a Muslim ruler at the time in the things. And so it obviously was a little lopsided in the things. However, and this is when you read more and more about some of these Ottoman rulers, they were pretty amazing in how fair they tried to be, and how careful they were, and how they were really trying to keep a lid on everything and things. And these are before you had radical Muslim sects back in these days. This is when Islam was Islam. And Islam is a great religion. You don't get to be as big a religion as Islam is and not be a good religion. But it's the people that create problems and issues inside any religious structure. And so, does that answer your question? Yeah, the answer is no. Okay, 2 wars and 2 intifadas. This is how we're going to go from that initial formation of Israel that we talked about. We had the West Bank, we had Gaza, and then how do we get from there to exactly what we have right now? And we did that through these 4 things: 2 wars and 2 intifadas. Easy for me to say, intifadas. The first war, 67 war, 6 days long. Okay, kind of an interesting war. It happened over a skirmish of river water. Anybody ever thought of that before? I mean, that happens how many times in history where there's a fight over water? That's what this is. That 67 war started that way. And now I said in the description when I started this, especially in the brochure, which you didn't get, that I'm going to talk about information, disinformation, and propaganda as we go along. Well, this is a great idea of how wars get caused by propaganda, because the Egyptians were thrown way off base because Jordan and Syria were putting out all this propaganda about Israel building up their army to do an attack, which they weren't doing at the time. But Egypt thought they were because of this propaganda put out by their buddies. So what did they do? They mobilized and sent 80,000 troops into the Sinai. Well, Sinai's southern part of Israel, across the river. They put 80,000 troops in there. So what's Israel think now? Oh my God, they're coming. Actually, they've already come. They crossed the river and things. So we better do something. So they have a little meeting and says, we're going to take out their air force before they do anything. So that's why this war only lasted 6 days. In the first day, Israel wiped out 300 airplanes in Jordan and Egypt and Syria on the ground. They never even got airborne because they didn't know what was coming, and they wiped them out. And then they did their little ground attack after that, and they wiped them out because they had no air support whatsoever. So it took them 6 days. They're all the way to Sinai, and they say, okay, timeout. We win, right? So here you see the lineup in here of what they did, how long it took them. Day 6, ceasefire. Why is that important? This is why that's important. This is after, now remember, all these different maps we've been looking at. It's important we do this. This is the map after the 6-day war. What's different about that you see right away? The big yellow area. What's that? That is the Sinai. The Sinai, which is now what? Part of Israel, because they won. So that's how much land they took after this war. What else did they do? What else is yellow now? The West Bank. Well, the West Bank was not part of Israel, right? So what'd they do? They invaded the West Bank and took the West Bank. What else is on there is now yellow? Gaza. See the little Gaza up there? Gaza was not yellow. Gaza was Palestinian. Gaza is now yellow. And up on the far top right of the thing, the Golan Heights. So anybody that's ever studied Israeli history or their wars, you know about the Golan Heights. And they did that, at least they said they did that, Israel, to avoid having artillery look down on their settlements, which is probably true. That's not a bad, that's pretty good logic on their part to do. So they took only enough land to prevent there being artillery that had overviews of their settlements. But they gained all this after the 67 war. So that's what wars do for you. And they started it, Israelis, because of disinformation and propaganda. Then we have the next most important war, the 73 war, the Yom Kippur war, okay? Who started this one? Egypt. Good guess, though, Judy. Egypt. Egypt started this one because they were all hacked off. You see this first comment, Israel was complacent. Well, they built this thing. If you look at that blue dotted line that runs along the river there, blue dotted line, that's called the Bar-Lev line. It's a series of huge fortifications and fences and weapons emplacements and things, and it's designed to be impregnable. Anybody else ever heard of any other lines like that were supposed to be impregnable? Yeah, and the Maginot Line, World War II, the Siegfried Line. Anybody that builds a line and thinks that it's impregnable has never seen water run downhill, right? You are not stopping anything with a wall and a line. It's not happening. But they had it, and so now what are they doing? They're sitting around drinking tea because they've got the line. Egypt kicked their butt for the first couple of days. You see the Egypt line there. It's a huge deal for them to get across that river. That's no small military task to get across that river and get 80,000 troops again now across the river. So Israel now is saying, what? We're screwed, and they were. But what came into play? Propaganda, disinformation, because I keep misspeaking, Egypt at the time started throwing out all this propaganda that we're on the way to Jerusalem, we'll be there in 2 days, we are kicking their butt. Well, they were, but not like that. They kicked their butt to get across the river, but they'd been slowed down. And Jordan, meanwhile, had attacked up in the north, but then they got this report from Egypt that said, hey, we're going to be in Jerusalem in 2 days. And they said, well, there's no sense us throwing our guys into the meat grinder. If they're doing this, we'll just stop here, keep the Golan Heights, which we want back, keep this, and we'll put some people in the West Bank, and then we'll wait for Egypt to finish this off. Except Egypt was what? Lying, doing the propaganda. So it did what? Gave Israel days and days and days to prepare and counterattack, which they did, and they won. Now, some people say, and that this has never been proven, and I can't find what I would call a good source anywhere, that the reason they stopped both sides is because Israel said, you keep going, we're going to nuke you. And they had nuclear weapons at the time. Israel did. So there's some conjecture on military people's part who study these things, like me, that that may have happened, but there's no evidence whatsoever that that actually happened. Just a conjecture. Yeah.
Any idea why Egypt was saying, hey, we're going to be in Jerusalem in 2 days, and they weren't?
It's what's the name of that? Macho. That's all it is. It's a fact. It's, you know, that's what it was. We kicked their butt. Well, how did they kick their butt? They got across the river. You know, so part of it was an attempt to intimidate the Israelis, and it did. It did. The Israelis thought we are screwed, and they were. Had Jordan kept going, because Jordan's military was 10 times better than Egypt's. Jordan's military was every bit as good as Israel's at that time. So had Jordan kept going, Israel was screwed, okay, at the time. But this is how wars happen. This is what, you know, these are the things that happen in a war. Now, we don't know whether it was the propaganda or the nukes. We don't know that for sure, but for whatever reason, Jordan stopped. Israel came back, and they won. Big battle, big tank battle, one of the biggest in history, and the Israelis won. And so what happened? This happened. So now, this is after 1973, not much changed, right? If you remember that last map that we had, not much has changed on here. Still on the Sinai, except what? What's the green stuff? Now, see the green stuff at the far left of this map? What side of the river is that on? Egypt side. So where does Israel now have a huge military force? On the west, this West Bank. So is that a big deal? Huge, huge deal. Because Israel now has a huge military force on the wrong side of the river. Now, there's one other green spot on there that happened. That's the only other thing that really changed. Golan Heights, all right? The Golan Heights now doubled in size. And they did that, why? Because they could, and they wanted to rub Jordan's face in it. So they said, we're going to take some more land just to show that you shouldn't have done that. Shouldn't have started. So that's why this happened. This is the new Israel after the 73 war. So look how big, how spread out. It's not like that today. And we'll talk about that. Now, what happened here? Well, after 73, and when Israel came back to life and they kicked everybody's butt in the end game, they said, maybe we should go into Lebanon and clean that place up. This is in the 80s now, 1982, actually, a civil war going on in Lebanon. And Israel said, we're going to go in there and take these guys, these people, and they didn't, they're, you know, once and for all. So we're going to go in and clean up Lebanon. So they got in this, god-awful civil war inside Lebanon for them and everybody else involved. People dying, lots of things. Nobody winning anything, nobody thinks. But what happened because of that invasion? These guys happened, Hezbollah. 100% because of Israel's invasion into Lebanon. That caused the founding of this group, Hezbollah, inside Lebanon, backed by Iran. Now, once again, we got Glenn here, so we got to watch our tiptoeing around, but it's a difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims, okay? Iran is Shia. They're the smallest population of Muslims in the world, Shias. are, but Iran is Shia, and it's one of the biggest actual numbers of bodies, population. Very powerful place. So they supported this group formation, Hezbollah, in Lebanon at this time. And they were very radical. You see at the bottom line there is their goal is to defeat what? Israel? No. That's not Hezbollah's goal. That's Hamas's goal. We'll get to Hamas later. But the Hezbollah's goal to defeat what? Western imperialism. So who's the devil? We are, according to Hezbollah. Okay. They are considered the most powerful non-state actor in the world. That's quite a title when you think about it. Most powerful non-state actor in the world in little bitty Lebanon. So they've got some oomph over there. And we'll talk a little later, but that what everybody's worried about now is them they're joining the fight a little bit, but they're really worried about them really joining the fight. They haven't. You can see here they've got somewhere between 40 and 150,000 rockets. You see a picture of them there. They did a lot of targeted kidnappings. They got started with some of the kind of instigated some of the suicide bombings, although it's really Hamas's specialty. And they've sent hundreds of fighters all over the world to support these revolutionary causes, particularly in Syria. They're very, very strong supporters in Syria. So really strong, we call terrorist organization called Hezbollah, all because Israel invaded Lebanon during their civil war in 1982. Now, how did we get from that map to today? This is kind of how. How long have we been trying, we being the whole rest of the world, to broker some kind of peace in the Middle East? Well, since 1948. Since it all started, there's been all these efforts to try to be. These Oslo Accords was the first time it looked like something was actually going to work. It looked, and this picture is probably one of the most famous pictures ever in history. This picture here, shaking hands on the White House lawn. Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin. Nobody thought those two would ever come within a mile of each other, let alone shake hands. So they came up with this idea called the Oslo Accords and then Oslo II. And the idea was Israel's they're going to move out. They're going to move out of the West Bank. They're going to move out of Gaza. They're going to reestablish a new entity called the Palestinian Authority, PA, who are going to be in charge and be the government in those areas. So that was the idea. And it looked like something might actually happen, that this might work and do that. And they kind of trundled down that path, moving like kind of peanut butter. But nonetheless, both sides were kind of moving along, doing that. So it looked like this was going to help. And it did help the Palestinians in a lot of ways, because in fact, the Israelis did pull back out of the West Bank. They did pull back out of Gaza, kind of. So here's kind of what happened again. And this map is what we have right now. This is the map that we have right now. How much of the Sinai does Israel have? 0. Gave it all back. Gave it all back. Because who brokered this Oslo Accord talk? Egypt. Egypt was the big hammer in that. They brokered these talks. And so Israel said, okay, here, take the Sinai back. They gave it back. They also, these hatched areas now, Golan Heights, West Bank, and of course, Gaza's too small to really look hatched, but it also includes Gaza. They pulled out of those, mostly pulled out of those, and they were no longer occupied territories, according to the Israelis. So this is the map. as of the early 90s, into the mid to late 90s, and then even into the early 2000s. This is the map. This is what it's like to be a Palestinian under the Oslo Accords. So you can kind of look and see who was favored who in these Oslo Accords. If you're a Jewish citizen in Israel, where can you go? Anywhere. Where can you live? Anywhere except Gaza. You can't move into Gaza. Can you move into the West Bank? Probably. They'll find a way to get you in there. You can move in, take over somebody's house, take over somebody's farm, and move in. And then you see whether you can vote, whether you can do other places that you can do. The biggest thing is, and the most egregious thing as far as the Palestinians are concerned, is the bottom one. And it looks like the most, innocuous one. But that's the one that causes the biggest heartburn. And that's, remember, we talked 700,000 people in 1948 were thrown off their land. And then since then, up to 2 million more. And Israel has said, you're never coming back. We are never giving you back your land. So that's the most egregious thing to the Palestinians, is the bottom one. Here's a slide, and I said this when I gave this presentation the first time, and my wife, Jenny, a lot of you know her. When I asked her to proofread this thing, when I was about three quarters of the way done doing slides, this was her. She said, this is the most important slide in the whole presentation, according to her. According to her, this is the most important slide, because this is, what is it like to be a child in Gaza? And this is what it's like. And so you can read what happens, how many wars are going on, what happens to you. You can, if you're interested in this later on, all you have to do is Google growing up in Gaza, and this baby will pop up. And you can read it in detail along with the articles and things that goes along to it. Essentially, and it says at the end, they don't really have PTSD because there's no end. It has never ended. But essentially, they have PTSD, all of them. And 50% of the population of Gaza is under the age of 18, 50%. Which is why when you see all these things in the paper now, how many children are being killed, that's why, because 50% of the people out there are kids on things. So that's what's happening. So what does this do? Does this create new Hezbollah fighters and new Hamas fighters? Every day. Every day. So this is a real problem. And then we have what? Because of that, because of these things, we have the rise of Hamas. Hamas is totally different than Hezbollah. You know why? These are Sunni Muslims. I'm not going to answer Glenn's question again, because that's another 5-hour lecture on what the difference between Sunnis and Shias are. They should be mortal enemies of Hezbollah, theoretically. And this is what the point Glenn was making when he asked the question. They should be mortal enemies. There's no way they should be cooperating, except they agree on one thing. And what's that? Israel's a bigger mortal enemy. So therefore, they're willing to shuck their own hatred of each other long enough to help each other out against Israel. They were formed in 1987, and this is how this kind of happened. Fatah, and you probably don't remember that, but Fatah was Yasser Arafat's party. He was the head of Fatah, and they were in charge of the West Bank. And they were also in charge of Gaza. But that didn't work out so really good, and Hamas ended up in control. Well, how did that happen? They being Hamas, were formed in 1987, so they haven't been around all that long. That's a pretty short period of time in the area we're talking about. They're a fundamentalist group. They are supported by Iran and Turkey, and they had uprisings, which are intifadas, and are we in the third one? We're going to talk about that. Turkey and NATO? Yes, The question was, is Turkey in NATO? And the answer is yes, Turkey is in NATO, and they cause all kinds of problems because of that and the things. For instance, things like Norway just joined NATO. Or no, Finland. And Norway and Sweden want to. Or Sweden. But anyway, Turkey say no, no, no. So they've got a veto power. So they are just keeping all these people out because they don't want NATO to be. And then they've got, you know, Turkey is another presentation, at least as long as this is how Turkey got to where they are right now, which is kind of hard to think. One thing to notice here, though, and this should be a cautionary tale for us and everybody else out there, is how did Hamas get to be in control of Gaza? Did they take over militarily and just stomp everybody down? No, they won the election. They won the election. In 2006, they defeated Fatah because they claimed Fatah was corrupt and we needed a change. You know, we needed a change. We're running on the change policy here, okay? And what else did they do? They poured all kinds of money and effort into social works. So they got a good reputation inside Gaza by doing social work, spending money. Whose money? Iran's. But spending money inside Gaza to get this thing. So they ended up winning the election because they convinced everyone Fatah was corrupt and they'd be the new non-corrupt people. Yeah, so what happened after they got elected? How many more elections? 0. So they got elected in 2006. They installed authoritarian institutions. They took over everything. They came up with this Palestinian basic law. And away we go. And so Hamas, since 2006, has been in charge in Gaza. Yes. Whoop.
Sorry.
First.
Is Fatah part of the PLO?
Yeah, Fatah, the question is Fatah part of the PLO? And the answer is the relationship between Fatah and PLO is like the relationship in Ireland between the Irish Republican Army and the things. It's the political, Fatah is the political arm of the PLO. So yes, absolutely the same thing. Did you have a question? No?
I can't remember.
Go.
I mean, something like Hamas. Who is their leader, and is it like a dictatorship?
No, not really. This is a loosely knit. They have a leader. Every organization has a leader. They have one, but he's not really dictated because these are zealots, and so they're all in there for the cause and doing the things. And so if he can convince them that he's the right person to lead this fight, then they'll support him and do that. Now, does he crack down? Of course, you know, there's no authoritarian group in the world that doesn't try to eliminate people who are saying that what they're doing is wrong. So if you're authoritarian, you just get rid of them or kill them. In this case, you don't just ship them off, you just take them out. So the answer is he doesn't rule by power, but he's not afraid to use it.
And haven't they, from what I remember in the news, they think they've got a few of the leaders?
The question is, they think they've got a few of the leaders. I'd say they have more than a few of them, but that doesn't do much for you. You have to, I mean, you know, we don't get too deep into how you run a military organization here on the things, but you have to understand how Hamas operates. Nobody has got a game. Nobody's got a war plan. They're not sending out guidance. They're not telling people what to do. It's all being decided in little pockets based on what they see right now in front of them. There's nobody anywhere telling these little pockets what to do because they can't talk to each other. I mean, physically, they have no physical way to communicate. So every response you see anywhere inside Gaza is all reacting to whatever's happening right now. There is no central guidance, central control, central leadership. Central leadership doesn't exist. What they're trying to do is wipe out this political central leadership by taking away. I personally think it's a waste of time because all that's going to happen is new guys are going to percolate to the top, and you just now hacked off another 700,000 people by doing what. That's just my opinion about what happens when you try to spend all this time to get the leaders of the things. Answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like you said.
I think it's pretty futile, but you know, I can understand their point too from the thing. So, anybody else? Yeah.
Revolutionary Guards on the ground.
Are there Revolutionary Guards on the ground? Oh, this guy's seen the presentation before. So, yeah, you don't remember? Oh, you're sleeping this part. Yeah, probably. Why have the Revolutionary Guards slide or talk about the Revolutionary Guards in this context? And the Revolutionary Guards are an Iranian group, huge group, 1 million people. Not like Hamas, not little, not underfunded, not everything, not any of those things. Inside the Revolutionary Guards, there's this Quds force here. And the Quds force is kind of like a military CIA for Iran. They do their clandestine, out of country actions. So they're not active inside Iran. They're active outside Iran in a clandestine manner, trying to help out with Iran's goals. So are there Revolutionary Guard forces on the ground in Gaza? Of course. Are there Revolutionary Guards military forces? No. They are not sending units of people in to fight. They're not sending things. They're sending money, just kind of like we would say in Vietnam or in the things. They're sending advisors, money, trainers, weapon trainers, those kinds of things. So yes, there are Revolutionary Guards. There are Quds Force people on the ground, but not units of them. They're not fighting as a force, separate force on the ground. Answer the question. Okay. It's going to be dark before we get out of here. All right. The Quds Force helped form Hezbollah, and they essentially control Hezbollah because they have what? The money. Quds Force has all the money. So, and they got a lot of it because Iran's got a lot of money. This was a watershed event in the Middle East. Anybody remember seeing pictures of this guy? Yeah, he was in the news for a couple, 3 days when we killed him. Okay, and he was the head of the Quds Force, not Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force, the clandestine thing. And he was highly loved inside Iran as a man. He was a man of extreme integrity inside Iran. Really, really revered inside Iran. So that was a big, big deal. That may have been kind of one of the bad decisions that we ever made to do that.
We took him out because
he's the head of the Quds Force and in charge of fomenting all this crap all over the world and the things.
Trying to blame him for 9/11.
No. Well, that's not to say people weren't trying to do that, but he essentially had nothing to do with that. Yeah, he's there are all these, I hate to use the word conspiracy theories out there about how and why things happened, and that was one, but he was not involved. They were not involved in that, the Quds Force.
Who is we?
Pardon me?
Who is we?
We, the United States of America.
You act on that. That's right.
We got him with a cruise missile. I don't remember. I can't remember. 2020. January 3, 2020. So that would still be the Trump administration, the lame duck portion. So, yeah, I didn't remember the dates. Fortunately, it's on the slide. Gaza today. This is what it's like to live in Gaza when it's not completely destroyed. It's often referred to as the world's largest open-air prison. And that's because if you see that dark line on the map up there. That line essentially totally surrounds Gaza, 100%. And it's either an 18-foot tall concrete wall or an 18-foot tall triple concertina steel reinforced wall, like in the picture on the left. So a wall like that totally surrounds Gaza. And so, and the entrance in and out is 100% controlled by the Israelis. In peacetime, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the Gaza population would cross into Israel every day and work there, did the things. They were a huge part of the Israeli economy, the people from Gaza in the time. So, of course, that's not happening anymore. So that has a significant impact on the Gazans and on the Israeli economy. The Israeli economies kind of went in the crapper because all these worker bees are no longer there to work. And you see what it's like to cross the border, that little middle, smaller picture in the middle there. That's what it's like to try to get through the border crossing going either way. So you line up to go, and then you see a typical construction, how it looks in the thing. And then now, see, all that time, that's all history to get us to October 7th, 2023. That's the day Hamas came through that wall, okay? Through that wall. We're going to do why and how. Why and how. So why did Hamas do this? Why in the world? Why do such a stupid things? Well, here's why. Their control of the Palestinian cause was slipping away. They said this. This isn't someone's assessment. They said this. Hamas was losing power because what? Life was too good. Even though they're inside this prison, inside the things, people's lives were improving. They had food, they had restaurants, they had shops, they had things, and they were having trouble stirring up anger inside the region. And this is a big, big deal. Israel was gaining Middle Eastern support, particularly from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a big fish in that area. Saudi Arabia was verbally threatening to recognize Israel as a state. Guess how big that would be if that happened in the Middle East. So Hamas says, we better do something so that doesn't happen. That's the mindset and the logic. So they said, well, and you say things. There are a lot of other things, you know, the settlements, the settlers are killing people, Israeli settlers, because they have guns and the local Palestinians don't. And so there's all kinds of conflicts going on in the West Bank. The status quo pact we talked about, they're blatantly, and here's kind of what happens here. And I'll give you, anybody remember the name Ariel Sharon? Yeah, he was a firebrand rock and roll general, kill them all kind of guy type of thing. And he was at one time the prime minister of Israel, and he's still a general and things. And he took 250 soldiers and went to the Temple on the Mount to pray. Well, guess how that fits in with the status quo? When you bring 250 soldiers to the Temple Mount. So that's a big deal. And that was one of the things that really hacked them off. So you got them, things are too good, all attacks by settlers in the West Bank, and most importantly, they're starting to lose control. And so they have to do something to gain massive international attention. They don't want to just gain Israel's attention. They want to gain the world's attention. So it has to be big. It has to be something big. And it's really, they, in the yellow there, they anticipated the carnage that's going on in Gaza right now. They anticipated that. And we're going to talk about why they anticipated that. But they anticipated that, and they saw that as a necessary cost in order to gain this international coverage. So kind of sad. And they expected when they did this, that day, all these other people would join them. And how much of that happened? Zero. How? Now, there's been more stuff come out. I cut off the changing of these slides about 3 weeks ago. So these slides haven't been changed in 3 weeks. And there's some new information that's come out. They planned this. I'm talking Hamas now. This is all Hamas. They planned this for months and months. They really did a lot of good work. They didn't share this information with anybody, including Hezbollah and Iran, who gave them all the money, gave them all the weapons, gave them all. They didn't tell them anything about what they were going to do. And they gathered tons of information. How? Because 10 and 20% of their people went into Israel every day, in and out of those gates, all up and down the wall, up and down the things, and they're taking pictures. They all got cell phones. They're doing things, and they are gathering information for months about where the military hard points are, where the sensors are, how they train, how they operate, how they respond, how do they communicate. They got all that information. They figured out how to breach the barrier. Well, Israel didn't think they could do that. What's it? This is the what? This is the Bar-Lev line. Remember we talked about the Bar-Lev? Well, this is the Bar-Lev line of Gaza. They were extremely disciplined in their execution, even though it was horrendous. They did what they were supposed to do. And yeah.
How does Iran feel about that?
How did who feel?
How does Iran feel about it now?
Oh, they love it.
Oh, they do.
Oh, sure. Why?
Because they're
Because they're not taking the heat. Hamas is taking the heat. Israel's taking the heat. And they're standing back and said, wasn't us, wasn't us. Yeah, they love this. This is the best thing that's ever happened to them. Yeah, all of it. Yeah, all of it. Not, all of it. And they trained and they used 35 drones in this attack. So here you have Hamas. I'm telling you what, there are no rocket scientists in Hamas. There are no tech wizards.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. So the fact that they can pull this off is pretty amazing. Here's a picture of some of the drones they use. Now they got some of these from, who makes good drones, these little cheapy things? Iran. Iran makes really good, cheap drones. So they got a whole bunch of these from Iran in pieces and then put them together. See the guy in the middle slide there, the kind of vertical one? He's in a motorized paraglider. They had 50 of these guys who they launched from the back and flew over the wall in a glider. Israel's actually, Glenn and I were just talking about we have coffee together with a group of guys on Thursdays, and we were talking about this Iron Dome defense. It's a really super capable thing, but you see the rockets, pictures of the rockets. That's the rockets that Hamas is using. They're essentially like an artillery round. They're not guided. You set in your little corners, you fire them, and you say Tel Aviv, and maybe you'll hit Tel Aviv, maybe not. That's how accurate they are. But they fire 1,000 of them. So some of them are going to make it. And so you've got this Iron Dome defense system at $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a pop, where these missiles shooting these things down. So Hamas loves this. They just shoot them off and watch them go. Israeli failures. This is a small list. They are a lot longer than this. A lot longer than this. The biggest one is in yellow there. All the lessons they learned from 1973. Remember that one with propaganda failures, the underestimating their opponent, communication failures, overconfidence in your line, in your defensive line. Every single one of those things they forgot. They were no longer doing. And every one of them came back to bite them in this area. They got warned by Jordan, by the king from Jordan himself, called Israel and said, there's going to be an attack. I want to let you know, because he didn't want a war. And, he didn't want to go to war. He didn't want to send his people to war. He called the king. He didn't send somebody. Yeah.
How would Jordan know if Hamas associated with what they were doing? How would the king of Jordan?
Everybody finds out something. Everybody finds it. Yeah, but here's what happened to Israel. Where was Israel focusing their eyes? Hezbollah. Because Hezbollah is what? The number one most important non-state actor in the world. They're the ones that can really do damage. So when they got warned, and two of their generals, two of their highest ranking generals in Israel met with Netanyahu and said, look, we know this, there's something coming, we got to do something. This is like 5 or 6 days before it happened. And he said, go away. They're not a problem. They can't do it. They don't have the ability to do it. So they made just mistake after mistake after mistake. The bottom one here, signals intelligence. That's kind of like our NSA, only not near as good. They can listen in on just about anything they want to. And a year ago, they quit listening in on the handheld radios because it was too much work and they weren't really getting anything. So they stopped doing it. So what did Hamas use? Handheld radios. They had no way to listen in, intercept, talk to it, do the thing. So there's just a series of errors on Israel's part. Hamas atrocities, and this is the right word in this case. You know, they came in and did some really, really shocking things intentionally. And that's also the key word that's not really up there on the things. They were indiscriminate and brutal intentionally. Children and babies intentionally, because what will make international news faster than anything? Killing kids. Yeah, faster than anything. They even took and provided the videos. So, you know, that's what they were up to. They killed somewhere, the number still hasn't been pinned down, but somewhere 12 to 1,400 Israelis. They took 240 or so hostages. But the yellow thing is the most important. The hostages were the most important part of this equation. The most important part. So they get they get all of the coverage, and then they get the hostages. And why are the hostages important? Because there's a long history of Israeli negotiations to get hostages back. And inside the Jewish faith is the equivalent of one of our Christian 10 commandments. And I don't really know how to pronounce this, so I'm not going to try. But that's the Hebrew word for it there. And it literally means redemption of captives. And that's what it says. It's the religious duty to do everything possible to get these captives back. Everything. And there's a list of times when they did that. Probably one of the most telling ones at the bottom there in 2011. They had one soldier that was kidnapped, and they traded over 1,000 prisoners for the one soldier to get him back. Yes.
Why was the Israeli response so slow? Why was it hours and hours and hours? How were they able to get all those hostages back in? It's hours.
First of all, they really didn't know what was going on for the first couple hours, because their mindset was they can't do this. They can't be happening. What happened at the Bar-Lev line? I mean, you know, technical things. The Hamas took out almost all their sensors. They took out all the communication from those posts. And there were only like, I think they're a half a mile or more apart where they actually had people. And only then 2 or 3. Or never more than 2 or 3 people in there, because they had it all automated. Sensors were the guns that they had, the machine guns, there were no people to fire them. They were automatically fired based on the sensors. Automatically. Nobody had to push buttons. So they disabled all that. So they disabled that whole system. And so there was no information coming in to tell them how bad it was. And their mindset is they can't do it. So when things started to come in, initially they were saying, oh, that's crap, you know, kind of a thing. And then they started to round up, well, and here's another thing. What kind of capability does almost everyone in the world ascribe to Israel's military? best in the world, fastest, more on the party, Mossad. How about Mossad? Oh, best ever there. Guess what? Error, 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 error. You just go down the list, and every one of those agencies, every one of those leadership positions made error after error after error. And they didn't have any ground forces in the area at all, because it was all, so they had to call people up. Well, they call people up, but they're not there. They're not in that area. So they got to get them together, get them over there. They started reacting and bombing Gaza in 3 or 4 hours. They were bombing Gaza within 3 hours. So they got that part down because Hamas didn't interfere with their communications. In that, they couldn't interfere with that. But they did interfere with everything right around the area where they breached the wall, and nobody knew what was going on. And their whole purpose in life was to do what? Hamas. Run in, blow things up, grab hostages, get out. That's the plan.
Do you think that this is all supposition? Do you think Hamas's idea was that it wasn't going to last long?
No. They know, I think they knew exactly what's happening now was going to happen. They knew Gaza was going to be obliterated. Is this whole thing going away? No, because, and we'll talk about it. We'll keep going, and I'll tell you why I think that's important as we go along here. So anyway, this is why they wanted the hostages, because they can trade that. See, in the first hostage releases, they traded them for a lot of stuff. So we'll talk about that. Israel's response. So this all started about 6:30 in the morning, okay, with Hamas, 6:30 in the morning. 8:23, what? 8:23, the word goes out to activate the reservists, which is almost all the military in Israel are reservists. The standing people in place, very small, because their reservists are trained better than most countries' active duty people. So it took them 2 hours to start this because of lack of information, poor leadership. 10:47. Now, they didn't hit 130 targets at 10:47. That's the first wave. But over the rest of the day, they hit 130 targets inside Gaza. That's a lot of targets, I'm telling you, having been a fighter pilot. That's a lot of airplanes and a lot of targets. 12:29, U.S. condemns the attack. 6 o'clock that night, they officially declare war. So that's your timeline on day one, October 7th. October 8th, Israel routes remaining Hamas ground forces. Those are the ones still left inside Israel, not the ones in Gaza. So they clean everything up on day 2 of the people that are still left. These guys and gals that were left behind on purpose, and they knew they were going to die. That was their job. But their job was to hold them off, make them pay, keep them away from the wall. That was their job. Israel orders a total lockdown of the West Bank. Now, remember, we talked about what the West Bank is. Well, guess what the West Bank has all the way around it? A wall. Surprisingly similar to the wall all the way around Gaza. So they lock it down. And then the Israeli Air Force steps up the attacks even more. 9th to the 27th, okay? And the reason for the 27th, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, the 27th is when they started the ground war. So from the 9th to the 27th, it was all air. All air, nobody on the ground in Gaza. 9th to the 27th. What's important in this whole list? What's in yellow? Everybody remember reading that in the news when the hospital was struck and they couldn't figure out who did it. And I don't think anybody will ever be able to tell definitively who did it. But probably it was a malfunctioning Hamas rocket. Probably. Because too many Western intelligence sources who are much better said that. But that's only probably. But it doesn't really matter because the outroar was extremely loud. Because the initial reporting was Israel did it. They attacked the hospital. That was what? Disinformation and propaganda. That word was put out by other sources, but did it take off? Like wildfire. Did people believe it? Absolutely. From the people it shouldn't have. And so it's going boom through social media like this. And then can you walk that back and say, oh, I lied? No, that's done. That impression's done over, the emotions has been set. And what happened there? The whole idea of who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in this thing started to not be as clear. Okay, up until that point, until October 7th, there was nobody that had anything to say other than Israel is the good guy and Hamas is the bad guy. That was absolutely true up until October 17th. Once that event happened, whoa, a lot of consternation started to be formed out there about, okay, what's really happening?
So in Gaza, they're just not all Hamas.
I would say, if I had to guess, I would say 2-3%, 2 or 3% of the total population is Hamas.
Palestinian.
Well, now we're getting into tricky terms and things, but yeah, they're all Palestinians, including the Israelis. Whether they want to admit it or not, they are also Palestinians. Okay,
So I should say,
that's why it's
Jewish, Christian,
and Muslim.
what is the percentage of that?
Oh, inside Gaza, it's probably 95% Muslim. Yeah, probably 95% Muslim inside that. The Hamas, of course, now remember we talked about why Hamas started this thing. Well, their popularity was going down for a lot of reasons. And there were a lot of people inside Gaza who just about had it with Hamas on the things. And so that's one of the reasons they did this. And now who are all these people talking about? Not Hamas. They're all talking about Israel, every one of them. So in that regard, Hamas was successful and they got the whole conversation shifted away from them and toward Israel. And then for the rest of the world, that conversation started to shift somewhat on October 17th.
The fact that 95% of Gaza are Muslims doesn't mean that the Muslims are Hamas, correct?
Correct. I would say of that, there's somewhere around 2 million people in Gaza when this thing started. 1.9, 2 million people, maybe 40,000 Hamas.
Mhm.
Not many in the big scheme of things. Yeah. What go first?
I'm confused. When you say they're Hamas, you mean they're supporters of
No, I mean, they're Hamas. They're part of they have said, remember that slide where they're wearing green headbands and all that? That's Hamas. If you're willing to put on a green headband and go out into the fight, then you're Hamas.
people who live in Gaza, the citizens of Gaza.
Are not Hamas.
They're not Hamas.
No, absolutely not.
That's what I thought the question was.
No, she said what percentage, I think. Yeah, it's very low percentage.
But then there's the question of how much support does Hamas have from the people in Gaza?
Yeah, I would say at the start of this thing, not much.
But
Not much, but now more and more and more every day. Every day that we go on, more and more and more.
Because Israel.
They're all dying. You know, they're all dying everywhere they look. And it's not Hamas killing them in their mind. In their mind. Okay. Now you have to go back to the kids slide when you grew up in Gaza. Who's been killing you and all your friends since you were born? Not Hamas. So that's, it's all this propaganda, disinformation. That's not necessarily propaganda, but you got to look at how Israel we got to be an enemy. How do you get to be an enemy? You get to be an enemy because you go into schools there. I read a bunch of articles or things in books where they go into schools and ask the kids, who are the Israelis? And then they have them a picture thing, and they all point to a soldier with a machine gun. That's Israelis.
To them.
Yeah, and the person in the school, the young child who's in the 5th grade. And in the school, that's who the Israelis are, is they're a guy with a machine gun. And oh, by the way, they killed my sister. And every one of those can say that in one way or the other. Every one of those people can say that. They killed my, pick a relative. They can all say that, every one of them. So it's that's why this thing doesn't go away very easily. Ground invasion begins. Okay, long and difficult, going to seek out and destroy. We talked about that. Airstrikes cut off communication and internet. They virtually have had no communication since this time, since the 27th. They cut off the north-south road. Now, just recently, they said move from the north to the south. They start and go door to door in these tunnels. You've probably heard a lot about the tunnels. And here's a depiction of what they look like. And they kind of are all under Gaza everywhere, just about everywhere. This is an interesting slide to me in a way. The one in the middle, of course, you got to remember that that white slide in the middle is put out by the Israeli Defense Force, Israeli Army. So how much trust can you put in that? You know, that's disinformation, something in propaganda. But if it's true, even a portion of it's true, what it says is, takes 360 truckloads of materials to build one of these tunnels. 360 truckloads. How do you get 300? And that's for one of these tunnels, 1 kilometer long. Well, look at how many kilometers of tunnels there are there. So you're building that many tunnels. Where are these trucks? I mean, how does somebody not know where these trucks are and what they're doing and how they're doing, you know, and all these kinds of things? It just, when you really get down into it a little deeply, you say, oh my gosh, what's real and not real?
But cement is cement. If it's coming in, they don't know if they're building a high rise or if they're lighting.
Yeah, 360 trucks. That's a lot of trucks and no high rise,
How was it coming in?
you know, and no high rise, you know, you got a low rise. So,
And how do they get through the barrier?
yeah, how do you, because there's essentially no manufacturing, no raw materials. Everything comes in by sea or through one of those gates. Well, who controls the sea? Israel. Yeah, so nothing gets in that Israel doesn't let in to the thing. So there's just lots of things to think about. Talking about Gaza, I looked and looked, I said this when I gave the presentation, to try to find a non-propaganda slide of this type, a before and after slide, because almost all of them, well, all of them except I quit looking when I found this one, but every other one I looked at had, here's what it was like, here's what it's like now. They weren't the same place.
Oh.
I used to do this for bomb things for a living, and I used to look at bomb damage assessment photos and things. And you look at this stuff and you say, who are you trying to kid? I mean, they may not even be in Gaza for all you know. You know, you can't. So this is the only slide I could find at all that is in Gaza and is the same place. So this gives you an idea of what's happening over there now. This is true. This is, now, remember, once again, I haven't updated these, so it's more than 40 days now, but at the time I cut off my information when I was making this presentation, it was 40 days since they started bombing and things. So that's what just a small portion looked like. And then this happened, you know, this is the worldwide reaction to the kidnappings. And guess who's fueling this fire? That's the IDF, Israeli Defense Force. And they're posting these things everywhere online, things, and it created a massive response. outside of Israel, all over the world, people supporting Israel. This all happened, though, October 30th, November 4th. Well, 40 days later, what are these crowds protesting now? Gaza and the bombing and the things. So much of the information and the things has shifted from this to that. And it all started on October 17th. Ceasefire. How did we get a ceasefire? Because we have what? Hostages, right? So did Hamas know this was coming? Absolutely. They counted on this 100%. They counted on getting many more people back. The people they got back were all people that were in there for life in prison to give back for a student or this or that. So this was very well calculated out by Hamas. It's the important there, Israeli defense minister, his quote on the bottom, and we see that now, and that's been the quote since they restarted again, is this thing could go on at least 2 more months. That's 2 months is a long time with what they're doing.
Because to the Israelis, the goal is to not leave any Israeli hostage, correct?
That's their goal.
That's the,
But what, and here, it depends. We're to a point now where, I'm sure negotiations are going on every day behind the scenes, and people are trying to get some, and at least your public self is saying from the Israelis, we're not doing a ceasefire. That's like giving up. That's like saying things. So if we say ceasefire, we're losing. That's Hamas is winning if we declare a ceasefire to do. So that's the public side of them. I am sure on the private side, they're saying, what do we have to do? We'll only do it if you give them all back. So I think that's probably where we are in the negotiations for the hostages now, is the next time Israel is going to say, we're not doing it unless you're giving them all back. And Hamas is saying, well, we're not giving them all back. If things get really, really bad, Hamas will just kill them. I mean, that's what they'll do. They'll just kill them. Because what's the downside for them? No downside.
That's assuming any of them are even still alive.
Oh, they are. Yeah, they're not that dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's probably some of them that had died for inadvertent reasons. They didn't kill them. No, they are way, way, way too valuable to let them die. They'll do just about anything to keep them alive. Here's what's happened in the U.S. Partisan divides, all things. Essentially, it's 50-50. Now, when it first started out, back before October 6th, 17th, and then things, it was like 85-15. At least 85, maybe 95-5. Now, roughly 50-50 across the United States. In other words, pick the bad guy. Oh, too hard. That's kind of where we're at now. We're in a situation where when you're trying to pick the bad guy, it's not easy anymore. Here's a little blurb about propaganda. I thought this is, and I love this crowd because most of you probably actually heard of Aldous Huxley and the Brave New World. There's a lot of places where people have never heard of that book. But I think that's a great quote about propaganda. And that's absolutely the case in the Middle East between these two. The propaganda on both sides has been so effective, neither side sees the other side as human at all. They are 100% monsters. Both sides see the other side that way. And when you really look at it, you can kind of understand how it doesn't make you like it or understand it, but you can understand how they got that way on both sides. And then confirmation bias, that's one of my favorite terms. And that just means that you will only read and listen to information that supports what you already believe. You are not interested in hearing anything that goes against your own beliefs.
United States, right?
Oh yeah, it's everywhere. It's not, that's a fact for every living person. That's anybody who says I don't have that, lying. They do, every single person. this thing from the river to the sea. That reason I put this in here is right before I was getting ready to give it the first time. This was in the news every day. The thing about this phrase, from the river to the sea. Well, turns out both sides use it all the time on the thing. Both sides use it in Arabic from the early 1960s and then appropriated by Hamas in the early 1990s. So Hamas took that to use on their own. It didn't mean that, what people say it means, before they took it over. It meant self-determination and a right to live from the river to the sea. But that's not the way Hamas uses it, the thing. And then you got a quote there from Netanyahu. Between the sea and the Jordan, there will be only Israeli sovereignty. So, two different takes on the same phrase. I asked the same question. How many people know what the term conflation means? Okay, got a couple. Here's kind of what it means in a nutshell, and it comes back to some of these discussions we've been having. When you say Palestine, what does that mean? Does that mean Palestinians? Does that mean, are Israelis Palestinians? Are Palestinians Israelis? Are Muslims all Hamas? Is Gaza all Hamas? Are Jews all Zionists? Are all Israelis Jews? No, only 60%. 40% are what? Arabs. 40% of Israelis are Arabs. What percentage of Israelis were Arabs in 1949 or were Jews? 7%. 7%. 1949. Now it's 60-40, sick because of all the influx of Jews from around the world. Zionists. Okay? All I'm saying is you hear people talk and they use the word Hamas and they use the word Israeli and they use and then these dog whistles. Anybody, you know what dog whistle means? Yeah. Well, those are dog whistles in this context, in the context of this thing. These are dog whistles, and people say that because they want to get a rise out of you. They want you to have an automatic emotional reaction when you do that. So, you know, anti-Semitism. Well, anybody ever heard of the Israeli Defense League? Yeah. Well, they are the world's biggest propaganda organization. You know, I mean, they can spew it out with the best of them. And everything in the world is anti-Semitism if you're in the Israeli Defense League. And so, yeah, a defamation league. I said defense. Defamation is what I meant. The Israeli Defamation League, not Defense League. Thank you. No, you can't. No, it's automatically anti-Semitism. Well, that's the conflation, say, and they're using it as propaganda. And the same thing goes with Islamophobia. You know, we talk about Hamas and things. We say this one word. That's not true. So it's really important to try, and it's really hard to be specific in the terms we use when we say a sentence. That what we're saying is what we actually mean. We think we know what we're saying, but it contributes to these effects, to these dog whistle effects.
It's a program.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
What is it?
What's a pogrom? What's a pogrom? Anybody know what a pogrom is? Oh, yeah, we got it. Go ahead, Deb.
And usually I've seen it in relation to Jewish villages, maybe in Eastern Europe, where they're.
Yeah, they come in and wipe them out, haul them off, ship them off, all these, and it can apply to anybody, but it's typically in the past been applied to Jewish people most commonly. And it's a governmental or usually a governmental thing. It's not a private organization or anything. It's a governmental directed event to move them out. And so that's, okay, and we talked a little bit about this. Well, actually we talked quite a bit about this. There's a justification and a rationalization on the both ways, sometimes all the way back to biblical times. Both sides using exactly the same arguments to make their case. And again, both of them are right, in a way. Both of them are right in a way. But then the key thing is the bottom one is the demonization on both sides knows no bounds. So the peace prospects, mistrust is widespread, both sides. Mistrust is widespread, deep-seated. The past is the key. But, and these are all important things, Israel has little or no motivation to negotiate. Why would they ever want to negotiate? Because they have the dominant military power. They have the dominant economic power. They have allies sympathetic to their cause, except guess what? That's going away right now very quickly, okay? So there's, at least initially, there was a very muted response from the international community concerning their continued settlement expansions and what's going on. So they have no reason. Why would they ever come to the table? Nothing to gain. So that's one of the big problems facing any kind of negotiations. This is the convoluted path. Again, if you're really interested in this thing, you can just Google efforts to end the Israel-Palestine conflict, and there'll be 12,000 graphics on what's gone on over the years to try to lay out all the different peace prospects and all the meetings and all the things that have happened. And these Oslo Accords were the best chance anybody had that. People really thought that was going to work. And then it didn't.
And what blew that off the track again?
Mostly Hamas, because at the time, remember they started this was in like 1990s. Hamas came in 87. But there's no way that Hamas wanted any kind of peace prospect. They didn't want any of that. So they started suicide bombings and things outside of Israel. They were the ones, remember when we had that period of time when there were all these suicide bombings going around? That was Hamas. And they were doing that to derail these accords and things. That was their sole purpose and it worked. It worked. So what happens? Not much. The answer is not much. There's no good answers. It's really hard, really hard to tell what's real. Once again, that's getting worse for all of us because of social media and AI, generative AI ability to create false narratives that look like real narratives. It's getting really hard to separate what's real from what's not out there. So we're well removed from what's actually happening. We can be sure that there's going to be more questions than answers coming up. Speaking of questions, how long did I do? Oh, well, that's not so bad, Ron. Hour. That's an hour. That's only an hour 40. Man, well, we knew it was going to be an hour and a half. Absolutely knew for sure it was going to be an hour and a half. So,
Okay, yeah, you were saying, the hostages are what is going to keep this in the forefront. But CNN, CBS, and NPR all reported when the hostages were being exchanged, they were getting back out of Israeli jails were teenagers, were kids, were people who had never seen a judge, never been formally charged with anything, had never had a trial, were all of the basic rights that we think of as far as, our human rights, for accused of a crime. None of them ever got that. They were picked up because they were throwing stones at Israelis, and they're just gone.
yeah.
And you said they're gone for life. They're
Right.
gone forever. And it's like, so is that true or is that propaganda? Because
No, that's true. The reason that these Oslo Accords almost worked was that the vast majority of Israelis, Jews, remember now you got to watch what you say, when the vast majority of Israeli Jews at that time were fed up with the government because they were going in and using military weapons against rock throwers.
right.
At the time. This is in the early 90s. And that you would see pictures all the time in the things. And the masses of Israelis said, that's enough. We're not doing, that's not us. We're not doing that. So they were about to throw out the Israeli government and things at the time to do that. So that's why that all happened at the same time as the Oslo Accords. There was a real sentiment inside Israel to make this go away. Stop this. This is not us.
But it hasn't gone.
But it hasn't gone away because who want, and you don't want to say left and right and things and get into that. But what happened was at the time of the Oslo Accords, they had a kind of far left government in Israel that wanted to go for peace talks, wanted to do the things, wanted all that. And then Netanyahu and his boys got elected the next time around, far right. And they said, forget it. We're not doing that. Not talking to those people ever. And so that's how you go from here to here in one election. And to do that. So it's kind of what happened. Anybody want to stay overnight or no? Okay, one.
You're the person to answer this, I suppose. What's the solution? Are we going to move into this debate of the two-state solution?
Well, two-state has been, everybody was talking about there's one-state solution, two-states. One-state solution has Gaza and the West Bank and things are inside Israel, but govern themselves, but are not granted state status. And then the two-state solution is that Gaza and the West Bank become actual states, countries, together as one country. And the only thing that would ever work is a two-state solution. It's the only possibility that would ever work in any, and of course, Israel's position has always been not happening. We are never doing a two-state solution. And so if you can't move them off that dime, you're not going to get a solution. So that's kind of where you're at. Yeah.
Can't you say that about the Arab nation or the Arab Association? They're never going to acknowledge that Israel can exist.
I think that that's possible because Saudi Arabia was going to, and had, what you're talking about here, and this is what happens in lots of places around the world. Hamas is an extreme organization. That's not Palestinians. That's not Palestine. That's not Arab. That's an extreme terrorist organization. Okay, but they're driving the train because they got in power, and then they got the military muscle and the things and control of all the government facilities, and they just said, well, we don't care. We're not letting you into any of these positions because we're in control of things. And so when you do that, you have a very small percentage of the population controlling what may be a strong sentiment to stop this stuff. And so it's really hard to say what would happen if it ever had a chance to breathe. Any of those things ever had it. Now, what has Hamas done now? They've kicked that can years downhill now because of their actions, which was intentional on their part because what? They are an extreme terrorist organization bent on the destruction of Israel, which is not Palestine or Palestinians. And so that's hence the conflation and the things, So you have an extremely small percentage of the people in a group controlling the world events because they're willing to do what we would call crazy things. They're willing to do them to get their way, to get their percentage. So when you have people that are willing to do things that are wildly outside the norm, they get attention. So,
Wow.
okay, let's get out of here before they turn the lights off.